So hello and good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're all logging in from. My name is Garrett Riccardi, and I'd like to thank and welcome everyone in joining us for this final talk for UCLA's AUD spring term. With the success and interest in the series, we probably have a combination of return attendees and new audience. So I just want to lay out just some basics for the conversation in the series. During the lecture, you're welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit questions. You do not need to wait until the end to send your questions. They can be uploaded throughout. At the end, we'll then turn to these as a way to open up the table to a broader discussion with our speaker. So without further delay, it is my great pleasure today to introduce Tei Carpenter, both a dear friend and an admired colleague, to top out the lecture series. Tei is educated as both an architect and in philosophy, and in 2014 established Agency, her design practice that operates between the cities of New York and Toronto. Tei is currently an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and adjunct assistant professor at Columbia's Graduate School for Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I choose to use the full and specific institutional titles here, hopefully with some significance. Tei's work has not only taken on the idea of institution itself, let's say through the formulation of an agency as opposed to an office or studio, but her agency's first agency, which I believe comes by way of Aristotle or perhaps later philosophers like David Hume, asks us, what does an architecture intentionally designed around active engagement with nature, landscape, urbanism, and planning look like? And so it's through this doubling that agency doesn't simply see architecture as a reconfiguration of material, space, and light into buildings, but a head-on questioning of the social dynamics played out through architectural form. Agency proposes through their work that we reassign or reascribe architecture as a part of speech to be more like a verb and less like a noun. To think of architecture as a collision or collaboration of people and processes instead of a collection of objects scattered throughout our built environment. Over the last few years, Tei has completed complex projects that show a deftness for designing across a wide range of scales. Her ability to tease out subtlety from large infrastructure and complexity from its smallest elements is what makes the work so compelling. Projects at the larger scale included the winning LA Plus Imagination competition entry, or the Big Brother Big Sisters headquarters, a 20,000 square foot community center in Houston, Texas. And at the opposite end, I don't know if we should call it perhaps a 5 square foot project, a new public hydrant collaboration with BMW's ADO platform in Brooklyn, a project that operates at a scale of a drinking fountain's arc of water to the mainline supply pipe for an entire city, cutting across mediums of infrastructure, industrial design, individual citizens, and larger publics. To facilitate some of these, Tei has served as the director of GSAP's Waste Initiative, an applied research and design platform that explores the role of waste in relationship to the city and architecture. Tei holds a Master of Architecture from Princeton University, where she was awarded the Butler Fellowship, graduated from Brown University with a degree in arts and philosophy, and in very short order has amassed a CV of exhibitions, awards, and publications that are perhaps all too numerous to list here. Just to name a few, would include the 2020 Urban Design Forum Emerging Leader Award, an AIA New York New Practice Award, and recently being named as one of the 100 best architecture firms by Domus magazine. But beyond all of this, I think of Tei as someone who exemplifies what is perhaps, at least from my point of view, the best quality of the best architects, which is generosity. A generosity with her colleagues, a generosity with her students, and through her agency, a generosity that asks that we give actively back to cities and landscapes. And so, not as to waste any more of all of your time, I'd like to thank everyone for coming and hand the screen over to Tei.
Great. Thank you, Garrett, so much for the really kind introduction. It's so nice to see a friend on the other side of the Zoom screen. And I'm so thrilled to be here. It's really a privilege. And I also just want to thank Chair Heather Roberge for the invitation and for transitioning the lecture series to this remote format. I think it feels more important than ever to have these kinds of outlets and platforms for social exchange, I think during this highly unusual and frankly really devastating time. So thank you so much for that. And I also just want to say thank you so much to Tess Stevenson for the magic behind the scenes, and to Kat also for all the organization. And I want to say thank you to my team also for my studio, currently spread out between Toronto and New York. And also I think thank you to this the studio, people who've been part of the studio over the past few years who are now also scattered across the world. And finally, I want to thank you, to the students and the faculty and everyone who's joining us here today for the talk over lunch. And I hope we'll have a chance to have a bit of a conversation later during the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. I'll share my screen. Just 1 second. How's that? Garrett, is that good? Great, okay. Okay, great, so I'm gonna get going here. So as Garrett said, my name is Tei Carpenter. I have an office called Agency. We are based out of New York City and also Toronto. This is an image from the studio in New York, which I share with my team, and then also a small group of urban designers and graphic designers and many plants, and those are friends and colleagues, Ben and Neil over there in the back. The practice is young, and as Garrett mentioned, we started in 2014. And this is just a selection of a couple of recent projects that we've done. And we work across scales and across formats. So just as a couple examples here, community-oriented residential buildings, also mixed-use buildings, installations in public spaces, speculative projects, exhibition design, interactive graphics, and then also applied research and design projects. So of course, I'm not in my studio right now. Here we are together in Zoom. And I wish I was actually there with all of you in LA at the moment instead of here in the Zoom room, but hopefully another time under different circumstances. And I just want to start the talk because I think it's hard not to at least acknowledge this moment that we're all going through somehow. And I want to start with this quote by the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, which I found really helpful in the past and I think about a lot, and which has kind of taken on a new potency, I think, over the past days, weeks, and months. We live in a present mixed with various futures overshadowing us. In essence, we live in a science fiction novel we all write together. This is an image that was taken last week by Tony Dunn at the Domino Park in Williamsburg, looking back at Manhattan. And I think it's an example of this present mixed with futures and of pasts. And for me, it highlights the ways that this is a moment to maybe pause and to reflect. In the background here, you can see the skyscrapers of Hudson Yards, which is the largest private development in the history of the country. Across the river here, you can see the Baruch houses, which is the largest NYCHA development from the 1960s. It's really in desperate need of repair. And then in the foreground, you have Brooklynites kind of desperately trying to return to normalcy, sunbathing in these socially distant circles, proceeding with life relatively unchanged. So while much of life is left outside of the photo that's revealed the structural inequalities in the country. And for me, I think this image underlines that we're not going to just return to a normal as we know it. And instead, I think it asks, which of these pasts, presents, and futures that are overshadowing us do we want to adapt with, do we want to leave behind, or take forward with us, and which of these do we want to radically transform? And so as a counterpoint to the Domino Park image, let's say, where individuals are sitting collectively in isolation in these bubbles, this piece by Lydia Pape, Divider, suggests a kind of connected individualism. I think a collectivity that connects individuals amidst shared experience, here as they try to move together in the same direction. And I think it also suggests the ways in which we collectively author the world around us as designers. Here, Pape collapses the observer and the producer into one, describing how we might actively contribute to the ways in which the world around us will be shaped and reimagined. And in many ways, I think the underside of the piece is even more important than the top of it. So you see how the individual bodies underneath the fabric are actually connected and make up the larger whole. Here they stand on a shared common ground, whether it's higher or lower, it's grassier or more bare in some places. And it may be a really fundamental observation right now, but these days when I go outside, I put my mask on. This is this new ritual that reinforces a realization that we're part of this larger whole, I think. And, even that, the inaction of staying at home has this kind of collective impact. So, with these thoughts kind of in the background, I'd like to share with you some recent work through 4 frameworks that set up some of the motivations and the preoccupations of the practice. And I'll try to kind of talk through these projects in a more open way. And I should say that I think what's now day 68 of the lockdown, for me at least, these concerns have been intensified in new and maybe unanticipated ways. So the 4 frameworks that I want to talk about are multiplicity, everyday collective, coexistence, and temporality. So the practice gathers around an idea of multiplicity. In this piece, the photographer Idris Khan appropriates multiple photographs documenting spherical type gas holders that Bernd and Hilla Becker took over the course of the career over 30 years. And through a kind of superimposition and a layering, Khan produces a new image that can be read as an accumulation of multiple parts, where the whole oscillates and rests in a kind of state of in-betweenness. And the ghostly aggregation suggests an accumulation of time, of states of change, enabling the parts to coexist together rather than to separate distinctly. And I think through this repetition of these industrial types, it also suggests a plurality and multiple points of entry to understand them anew. In terms of this framework of an everyday collective, this is a piece by a Brazilian artist named Renata Lucas, whose work I just really adore. And here it's called Cruzamento from 2003. She repaves an intersection in Rio de Janeiro by layering the asphalt with plywood, giving that in-between space of the intersection a kind of form of its own. And by intervening in the built environment of the city, Lucas focuses on the functions and uses of everyday sites and their infrastructures. So she reveals here deeper underlying structures and systems to find ways to meaningfully transform them. I think today we're seeing this renewed value in these everyday collective spaces, whether it's parks or even the sort of transformations of these urban elements. Here, this is a proposal in Milan where the streets become the sidewalks. Here on the right is a photo that Marilyn took over the weekend on McDougall Street, and the sidewalks are kind of becoming the living rooms. Similarly, stoops are becoming living rooms. And I think such elements of the city that are civic resources and actually essential services of the cities can become endowed with new aesthetic qualities and affordances as everyday collective spaces. The third framework in coexistence, I like to use this image. It's of a hermit crab living in a soap bottle cap. And I think it highlights a tension between the society and nature. So, which suggests that they're not opposite, but rather that they're increasingly intertwined and maybe codependent. And the image suggests also an approach to sustainability that, both mitigates human impact while also admitting to it through new modes of material reuse and co-production with nature. And so this would be in counterposition, let's say, to the 1970s, when architectural responses to the environmental crisis produced works like Fuller and Sadow's Dome over Manhattan, which was a kind of closed world, which the enclosure insisted on a kind of binary of a condition of society on the inside and the nature would be on the outside. Instead, in the practice, I'm interested in how to maybe work with concepts of coexistence, of co-production, working with nature, not against it, designing for and with non-humans and multiple species. This last framework, temporality, this is a piece that some of you may be familiar with by Sarah Wigglesworth and Jeremy Till. And it's a documentation of the ritual and event of a dinner party, from the very careful setting of the table for 8 guests at the top, and then the kind of spontaneous happening of the party that unfolds and is traced over time, to then the mess that's left on and around the table at the end of the party at the bottom. And for me, the work describes not just the ways in which we consider how time occurs and unfolds in space, but also the ways in which space and design can accommodate the making of rituals, both familiar and also new, and to possibly allow for multiple relationships and activities to fold in time. And so an example of this might be the design of Thomas Jefferson's bed alcove in Monticello, which is an object that straddles this threshold between his dressing room and his study, allowing him to roll out of bed as he sees fits into either his dressing room or his study in the morning. Or similarly, even the idea of how moving the bed out of the bedroom allows for new rituals to occur over the course of the day as the rooms are occupied and as they're used. So in the practice, these 4 frameworks, I would say they kind of run in parallel. They sometimes converge and they occur maybe to different degrees in the projects. And I'll try to illustrate them in the work that I'll show. And so again, this idea of multiplicity, of an everyday collective, of coexistence, and of temporality. So today what I want to do is I'll present 5 projects in relationship to those 4 frameworks. And I'll try to leave some time at the end of for discussion, and I'll kind of go through these quickly. So I'm starting with a project that's like the newest project in the studio. It's totally in progress. But I thought maybe it's a good time to show in progress work since a lot of things are in progress right now. It's a mixed use project with commercial on the ground floor and then residential above it, and began earlier this year before the lockdown. And luckily after a bit of a pause, it's still underway. But we've been adapting the design to think about the space a bit differently over these past few months. This is a photo of the studio last summer. This is a friend, Dan Tae Young. We were doing a collaborative project, but I wanted to point this image out because of the clock that's in our studio. This is a 24-hour clock by the artist Tauba Auerbach, who designed it as a way to become friendly with time rather than treat it as an enemy. The clock drives me totally crazy, actually, every time I use it, because it requires more time to figure out what time it is. Someone in the office installed it, but somehow it's in those few minutes that it takes to read the clock that it produces a kind of pause and maybe an awareness of time through reading the clock. So the clients for this project, they're a young couple. They may grow their family eventually, and they wanted to think about the residential part of the project and how it could maybe be flexible and even considerate to anticipate a variety of activities to occur throughout the space. So this drawing takes that idea of the 24-hour clock to sort of simultaneously describe the activities that would occur inside the home. So the circle then becomes the kind of space of the home that takes place over the course of the day. And this also shows time and the condition of being inside or outside of the home. So in the gray area, this is when you'd typically be outside. So this would be, let's say, a typical work day for one of the people in this couple, you know, where they actually are leaving around 7 a.m. They get back home in time for dinner. And so they're not actually in their home for that long. And I think before the lockdown, this would have been a kind of typical day, mostly out of the house, maybe at home on the weekends. But, you know, I think things have changed a lot. And this has been a conversation that's been kind of ongoing, actually, with them as we've been thinking about the project. you know, and since the lockdown, we've been working on a series of drawings that maybe draw through and help us understand how the space of the home and of this home has been kind of intensified. And I should just say that these drawings are not assuming to be comprehensive or universal in any way, but speak specifically to this couple and possibly to a few of us who can work from home. You know, for example, just to make the point, I think in talking to some, you know, friends who are actually essential workers on the front line, they're actually working around the clock and are at home even less, and even having to quarantine from their families. So this would maybe, for example, draw through that day where they're actually going to work for an even longer period of time. You know, but for this couple, for those of us working at home, maybe the intensification of the interior of the home and the house and the elements of the house then have to accommodate for almost all of our activities, you know, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally. And with only a few occasions to exit the house, whether it's for exercising or maybe shopping. And these, you know, elements of the house are sort of being used and misused, you know, where the bed for sleeping becomes the desk, or I was on a conference call the other day and someone was using their closet as a phone booth, you know, because it was quite a space in their house. But this drawing is kind of trying to show, to try to understand a little bit about how we're using the space differently inside the home, and how, for example, this would be a similar kind of work day, let's say, where work is now collapsing inside the house alongside, you know, other things like health and eating. You know, in some cases, for example, I think the regular hours and schedules have actually shifted around because of the upending of normal routines. You know, so for example, I think students, let's say, or, you know, teenagers are actually working in different chunks of time, or can be afforded to because of digital recording platforms, for example. And the home now has to afford not just these domestic activities, but also forms of work, of commerce, of leisure, of sociality that are now migrating into the home. You know, I think in that last drawing, it sort of showed how there's more leisure time because of the reduction of commuting and of traveling. I think for others, there's maybe less time because of the collapse of childcare or family duties. And so, you know, for example, in this drawing, you know, work actually gets displaced now to the evening after dinner, when childcare duties or family care duties actually have to happen during the course of the day. So for the client, you know, some of the conversations have just been around, you know, how each person's daily rhythms and rituals are getting shifted and upended, and how the space of the home then acquires this new meaning somehow in terms of how the apartment can actually accommodate and afford these other activities. So I think this is just kind of some background, obviously really fresh material that we've been sort of thinking through. The project is in North Brooklyn near the East River. This is a similar view actually from that image I started with, looking back towards Manhattan. This is the Empire State Building. As I mentioned earlier, it's a mixed-use project. This is the existing building. It's a kind of typical pre-war building in that area. It was actually used to be a candy shop at some point in the 1900s. So essentially, this is the existing, and then this is the proposed proposal. And what we're doing is we're realigning and then opening up the windows on the facade to keep the kind of existing rhythm, but then making them almost floor-to-ceiling windows. And then using the existing clapboard as a kind of starting point to then, as a kind of density starting point to then rotate 90 degrees. And so the facade is a kind of perforated and pleated metal screen that introduces a depth and shadow on the street. The density of the pleats changes from the commercial first floor as then it moves up to the residential, and then to the top floor, which is what we're calling the crown. There's a transparency to this perforated metal screen. Here you have access to balconies on the second floor and the third floor. So you can actually get directly onto the street. And then the unused square footage that was on the roof, we added a small space, which we're calling the crown, and it's made of this reflective aluminum to reflect and also dematerialize the sky. And I'll sort of show you a little bit more about that in a second. The crown also becomes the skylight for the entire staircase that connects these three floors. The stair is also made out of a perforated metal material to then bring light down into the center of the house. And so then going back to this idea of a design that maybe accommodates for the intensification of time and activities inside the house, the project is essentially a kind of fat wall, or a kind of thick wall that absorbs the elements of our everyday lives into its design across the three floors of the house. So that wall introduces a kind of small T in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. And then here we explode it, and I'll just sort of show you what we're working through right now. On the 2nd floor, it's the living area. The 3rd floor is the bedroom area, and then this top floor is that crown, which becomes a kind of open-ended multi-use space. And that thick wall actually starts to accommodate all these activities. And here it's showing how the sort of operations start to work throughout the day, maybe. We've been mapping on the activities from the 24-hour clock diagrams onto the plans and thinking through the rituals of the day, and designing how the wall can kind of accommodate all those activities. So here it's primarily cooking, eating, leisure, and then work. And then here it's primarily sleeping, leisure, but then also storage and a kind of backup workspace on the 3rd floor. And then on this crown floor, it's a flexible area with access to 2 adjacent balconies. And it becomes this kind of special area, you know, hopefully in the future for gathering, possibly hosting friends for dinner together someday. And so this is an image of that crown space that's designed for this access to the exterior, but then also really fundamentally to think about accommodation for this intensification of multiple activities throughout the day. So this is kind of where we are in the project, but I just want to share with you some of those thoughts. This next project is for Big Brothers Big Sisters Houston headquarters. And this is a project that actually launched my practice in 2014 and was also sort of an accident in some ways. We were asked to develop a concept design and images for what I thought was a fundraising through a friend who was involved in the organization. And we did a kind of quick fire intensive research and design for just a couple weeks with a really amazing team down in Houston that summer. And then we presented them with a few key ideas and images. And then, you know, a couple weeks later, we got a call that they wanted to move forward and needed construction drawings as soon as possible. So I guess you never know what's going to turn into a project, is what I learned from that experience. So some of you may be familiar with Big Brothers Big Sisters. It's a global nonprofit that serves children who are facing adversity by making one-to-one mentorship relationships that are long-lasting with volunteer mentors. And the founding belief is that every child has the ability to succeed and to thrive in life. The organization is really results-oriented, and historically, the mentorship relationships have helped, you know, kids to continue with school, to graduate with high school and then also college, improve learning capacity, and then also improving education, and then also staying out of trouble. And then the children that they serve many are from low-income families or non-two-parent families, and there's just a huge waiting list for hundreds and thousands of children, both across the Lone Star community and then also in Houston specifically. And so there's just not enough mentors to meet the demand of the kids. And so that was really the kind of charge of this project, was the organization had this urgent and growing need to expand its services and increase its visibility within the city to attract new mentors. And so this was the existing headquarters that was located actually in a former doctor's office outside of downtown. As you can see, there is really very, very little natural light. Few of the offices had any windows. Each of the offices was sort of atomized because of the doctor's office, which made it really difficult to collaborate across the organization. It also made it really difficult to produce any kind of community, both within the organization through the staff, but then also to make any kind of connections or host kind of meaningful events for the kids who they refer to as the littles, or for the mentors even, who they refer to as bigs. So there was no kind of opportunity to meet one another. So the site is located in downtown Houston. It's on a kind of urban island. This is I-45, it's an elevated highway. This is the Buffalo Bayou. This was actually the existing site, which was a windowless massage parlor and a health and fitness center called Stressed Out. And then this is another view of the site. And you can see how it's surrounded by these parking lots, also an electric transmission station, but these incredible views of downtown Houston. This is the Philip Johnson Pennzoil Place building. And what we wanted to do is to help the organization transform from, let's say, an introverted condition, as in the existing office, to sort of more extroverted one, to think through ways that the building could help to inspire new mentors to volunteer, and then also establish the organization's identity in the city. This was an early site model. It was really important to think about how the building could be recognizable and experienced at different speeds, particularly that it could be visible on the highway. So this is the I-45 highway, and then this is also I-10. So for commuters to actually recognize it driving by on the daily commute. Really early on, through sort of a sets of study models, we were conceiving of the building as having this thickened public zone, which is this blue area. And that public zone would be both the programmatic threshold, so it's this sort of the space in front of the yellow wall, the programmatic threshold of the project, but also the face or even like the billboard of the organization. We had a really low budget, and we used very low cost, readily available materials to produce a kind of volumetric building with a pretty simple seesaw roofline. And what we tried to do is to take the existing program of the organization and kind of turn it inside out by adding a number of public programs that they didn't have. So this 3-story atrium lobby, there's also a rentable space, a rentable event space on the 3rd floor with views to downtown, and then also a public cafe on the 1st floor. We're also interested in introducing a kind of transparency with a variety of large and small window apertures that would help to underline the mission's core values of openness and vitality. This is a butterfly section that shows that thickened public area. So this is the entry where you then enter in, and this is a stairway that connects the 3 floors through balconies, and it aims to kind of enhance a kind of interaction and communication between the staff, but then also the volunteers and the visitors. And the idea was that, when you enter the building, you actually feel like you're immediately part of the organization rather than being kind of sequestered into a waiting room of some kind. And the headquarters, we were given the program of an office, but the headquarters really had to be hyper flexible to accommodate for all kinds of different uses across the 3 floors. So this is the entry space, and then this is that public cafe area. There's a playroom that is then encircled by meeting rooms and interview rooms. This is that 3-story atrium space, and then this is the entry then into the cafe. This is the public cafe area where people can kind of come in just to grab a coffee, that then looks out into the meeting rooms. And then this is one of the interview rooms that then looks out onto the playroom. And we were really fortunate to work with Steelcase, who was really generous in donating some of the furniture. There's kind of flexibility built into these spaces for board meetings or for kind of educational seminars. This is the 2nd floor. Here's the atrium, and then you have the kind of ringing of 14 private offices, each with all have their own windows, because no one in the old building had that. And then it rings a kind of open office space in the center for roving employees. And then these were kind of these balcony fingers that we included to kind of make visual and physical connections. This is the office that produces a kind of transparency and maybe a layering between the spaces. And then this is the 3rd floor, the catering spaces in the back here. And then this is the balcony that overlooks the city of Houston downtown. And all kinds of events take place here. There was a prom here last month, also weddings. And so this is that 3rd floor space with the balcony at sunset looking back. And it's also the space of Great Day Houston, which is a daily morning talk show that takes place on the 3rd floor, and it's a revenue generator, but then it also brings all kinds of guests to introduce them to the mission of Big Brothers Big Sisters. And of course, I never thought that Snoop Dogg would come to one of my projects, but that was really neat. He came by not so long ago. And then this is a recent photo from a friend, so just kind of highlighting that idea of that visibility from the highway. I'm gonna try and show you a range of work. So I'll go through this one kind of quickly. We're going from Houston to Carlsbad, New Mexico. And this is a winning competition entry. It's the winning design for a marker system for radioactive waste storage for the Department of Energy's waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico. And I first came across the history of this site, and I was really fascinated by the story through this movie that Peter Gallison and Rob Moss made called Containment. And the brief for the project asked for a system that could communicate the dangers of nuclear waste buried below the surface, and to also deter human entry there for up to 10,000 years. This is a task that Peter Gallison has called both impossible and necessary. And in some writing, he's done really interesting writing about this, sites of contamination, and then also specifically about the WIP site. He describes the importance of bringing the visible into visibility, because unseeable abstractions like something like nuclear waste with such a long material life, they vanish from national awareness once they are externalized outside of perceptual range. So we're interested in how to think about the visibility of this kind of a place like this. It's a 16 square mile site in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico, and it's managed by the Department of Energy as an active site right now, and it will soon move into passive controls for the life of the site. And they've actually, they're thinking about this marker system and trying to get this activated over the next couple years once it goes into passive control. Waste isolation pilot plants like this one, and like several others around the world, work in such a way where nuclear waste is disposed of by burying it in a repository that's underground. And the repository actually relies on self-sealing of geological storage of nuclear waste. So within salt formations that actually creep under pressure. And they then eventually collapse and then encapsulate the nuclear waste within the Earth's crust. And so there's this sort of crazy kind of sectional relationship that happens in places like this. And so just to put the time scale of 10,000 years in context, the caves of Lascaux are maybe 25,000 years old. Stonehenge dates back to maybe 6,000 years old. And so effectively the marker system had to be kind of transliteral. It could communicate with both humans and other species for up to 10,000 years, and effectively say, do not enter, radioactive waste is buried here. And these are just some examples of past proposals. In 1993, when the DOE was looking for a solution to the WIP site, they were working with a group of geologists and semioticians and artists and futurists to think about the future of the site. And so a couple examples from those proposals are spikes through bursting grid on the top, which essentially granite spikes coming through this Cartesian grid, or black hole on the bottom, which is essentially a kind of poured black dyed concrete across the site that then would become so hot it would become uninhabitable. So as a starting point, we thought about the way in which Anna Singh talks about nature in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And she describes an approach that accepts the environment as compromised as a starting point, and admits coexistence with contamination and other species as a given to open up new possibilities. And so while historically many of the solutions to the problem have used fear tactics to deter entry, Testbed proposes a gridded field of carbon dioxide capturing strategies that produces a kind of active marker system that stores one form of energetic byproduct, here which would be the carbon dioxide, in the surface above another, so the nuclear waste below it. And so to sort of try to illustrate the sectional relationship, we drew out a core sample of the project that indicates the geological strata of it and the notion of its longevity as it relates to layers of the Earth and the kind of collapsing of the past and also the future together. This array of carbon dioxide capturing technologies is diagrammed in that top row in the slide. And these strategies kind of mitigate the effects of global warming through forms of decarbonization that include, let's say here, this is called direct air capture farms, which are essentially building scale artificial trees. And then also in situ and ex situ geologic and mineral sequestration strategies. So effectively using the same techniques, so using the earth and then also using rocks as ways to actually decarbonize the atmosphere. So there's a sort of similar technique as they're doing to store the radioactive waste. This is the perspective of the project in 2017. And Testbed is designed as as an entropic process. It's a geological earthwork that can transform over time with a combination of formations that are both natural and then also artificial. And the idea is that through this continued growth and transformation, these new geologies might mark the site as something slightly strange and maybe unfamiliar, something that could deter both human and non-human entry, and then communicate otherness by intervening in fundamental processes. I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit to these last two projects, which are public installation projects and deal with maybe that idea of the everyday collective. Flatiron Crossings is an invited annual public space competition that's hosted by the Van Allen Institute for a holiday installation at Madison Square Park in New York City. We lost the competition, but it's a really interesting site. It's a really iconic intersection between Fifth Avenue and then also Broadway in New York. It's immediately across from the Flatiron building, and then next to Madison Square Park here. You know, and more recently, the site has been occupied by a triangle for seating and temporary parking barricades. Here we're looking south towards the Flatiron building. Here we're looking north to the Empire State Building. The site's really kind of transitional and incomplete. It's made up of waste bins, of planters, of temporary seating, questionable advertising. And we're really interested in the urban surface of the Flatiron and the intense presence of small scale infrastructural elements of traffic exchange and management. You know, these everyday infrastructures that repeat, they proliferate, and they kind of exist in the background of the city. So traffic delineators, crosswalks, channelizers, cones, speed bumps, those elements that mediate the circulation of cities around the world. And I think these urban inscriptions are certainly more present than ever now. Notations that maybe choreograph and control how people interact throughout the day. And I think, you know, today they're completely shifting our awareness of protocols and movement throughout urban space. So we were interested in trying to use these infrastructures, but to also capture maybe aesthetic and atmospheric qualities of infrastructures, inspired by the work of a painter like Mary Corse, who uses these really beautiful glass microspheres and retroreflective paint to produce these really kind of sumptuous paintings. And it's actually the similar paint that's used on crosswalks for illumination at night. So the project itself reforms the elements of the city's small-scale traffic management to create a kind of immersive and internally illuminated field. It encourages interaction in the center of it to become a place to stop rather than to move through, and to really kind of manifest new rhythms in the site. And what we did is we took over the maximum allowable site area to design a field rather than an object. And we always called it a kind of infrastructural camouflage project. It's an array of custom elements. There's 62 custom, let's say, delineators, and then 16 custom, you know, bumps. And it's this field of internally lit poles then sits 45 degrees to the city grid. And then each of these poles stands above head, and they're attached to the ground with a kind of flexible anchor to allow for subtle movement and a kind of wiggle. And the poles are finished with this retroreflective paint, and you know, offers visitors a kind of moment to orient or even reorient within the city in this field, and possibly produce even a kind of glowing experience with the interplay of people, of headlights, phone flashes, and to really kind of think about how the background might become the foreground to produce a different kind of collective experience at the site. Part of the project, I really enjoy collaboration, and so part of the project in building out our team was not to just have engineers, but I also asked two artists to join on the team, Katie Pyle, a choreographer who has a team called Belez, and then Andrew Andrzejak, an artist. And I had them on the team to then do site-specific performances in the installation during the holidays. This last project is a new Public Hydrant. It's a collaboration with Chris Wobkin, who's a dear friend and then also a really fantastic artist. He has a studio called the Extrapolation Factory that I recommend you go check out. We are commissioned by a curator named Jane Withers as part of a research and design exhibition at ADO in Brooklyn that's run by BMW Mini. And it asked how design can help to address the drinking water crisis. And sadly, ADO actually is one of the casualties of COVID. And recently they just announced that they'll be closing, which is unfortunate because it was really a great platform for young designers in New York. But we contributed to the Drink Local section with Studio Swine and then also with Ooze. And we were asked, how can designers help to reimagine ways to deliver water in cities as an alternative to single-use plastic bottles? So the starting point of the project was to look at everyday infrastructures of the fire hydrant in New York City. And while this everyday element may seem really small, infrastructures can never really be minor because they're connected to larger systems and operate at multiple scales. So here in this image, we see the element of the fire hydrant juxtaposed with the kind of mass repetition of its infrastructural network. So instead of seeing the hydrant as an emergency infrastructure, we wanted to reveal it as a source of clean drinking water. And while New York City is actually one of only 5 cities in the country with a high enough water quality that does not require filtration, this is often neglected instead to buy plastic water bottles from bodegas, etc. And this drawing sort of shows where the water is coming from. Most of it is coming from the Catskill, Delaware watershed up north, and then it comes through the aqueducts and the water tunnels. And then what we wanted to show in this drawing is actually how the water main that then feeds the taps in our houses and apartments is actually also connected to the fire hydrants that we use to put out fires and wash our cars. So that water is actually potable. So we are inspired by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection's Water on the Go program, where a fire hydrant is hooked up to create a kind of collective drinking fountain. And so the project actually came out of discussions with the DEP about redesigning these fountains. When we went to go visit with them, we saw people washing their dogs in the fountains, washing their lettuce. It was kind of a mess. And so they wanted to think through both how to communicate that these are for drinking water, but then also how to engage with the public and how they might think about drinking locally, especially from fire hydrants, and how to try to shift perceptions about drinking locally. So just some facts: it's almost 1,000 times more expensive to drink bottled water than tap water, and it takes about 1.5 million barrels of oil to make those plastic bottles, which is enough to power 250,000 homes or even 100,000 cars for that same year. We were really interested also in how, in the kind of celebration of a city's civic resources, like how fresh water in cities is celebrated in cities like Rome, where infrastructure or aqueducts are actually made visible with fountains that dot the city. And then also the marking of the end of those aqueducts are these amazing installations like the Trevi Fountain here, or for example, the Nasoni, or the kind of big nose fountains that are public water fountains around the city that make fresh water accessible. These are both bottle filled, but then they're also drinking fountains, and they introduce these sort of new gestures into the city. So you have to kind of plug the nose of the fountain, and then the arc of the water actually comes out. So you can see this little child doing that ritual. So we were inspired to imagine new forms of public interactions. We want to test drive this idea in public. So the project is really 3 one-to-one interventions that are designed to be both prototypical and then also transportable. And originally they were designed outside of ADO here, pictured. And the three prototypes, or let's say hydrant hacks, are called Hydrant on Tap, Hydrants for All, and Hydration Station. And these are all meant to produce a kind of gateway of reimagination of an everyday experience with your water infrastructure in New York City. And we certainly kind of thought back to, historical commons, let's say, where people will bring their cows to go graze, or even sort of water commons like a well or a water pump historically. And these, of course, are just 3 of what could be many, many, many possible prototypes for this project. But we wanted to sort of test drive these 3. We worked with Master Plumber. This is Bill Soblow, one of our collaborators, who is really incredible out of Sheepshead Bay, because we're using the materials of plumbing and also the logic of water infrastructure to try to create these pieces. So of course, there's a ton of prototyping and testing, and also kind of familiarization with a new language of water infrastructure. So this is Chris transporting one of our pieces. We were working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard at this point. This is his kind of bicycle with a lance almost of one of the pieces as he was moving it around the city. So Hydrant on Tap is a bottle refill station that oscillates between everyday and then emergency use. We developed a set of patent drawings in plan and then also an axon to specify and then also to illustrate the scale of intervention of the prototypes themselves. This is Hydrants for All. It's a multi-species water fountain for humans, for pets, and also for birds. We did actually a workshop with the Parks Department that summer, and one of the suggestions was whether we could actually make an attachment for pollinators, or actually whether we could make a separate pollinator fountain for the bees in the park. This is Hydration Station. It's an immersive microclimate and sprinkler in which visitors can kind of relax and refresh. And I don't know if you can tell, but it almost produces a room, almost like a water room underneath it. And you know, in this version of the prototype, we had also been imagining whether you could have a kind of bollard bar or transform some of the bollards into a kind of seating of some kind. Part of bringing the project into the public realm was also how to communicate it and the kind of media around it. So to try to communicate if someone came across it, one of the interventions in the street. So this was a series of stickers that we designed and that we kind of spread around the neighborhood on lampposts and street signs to sort of spread the word. So this project is really a way of trying to look at the city to reconsider the ways in which water infrastructure has a capacity to work double duty towards collective public space that could have maybe functional but then also pleasurable ends. We're currently working on a pilot project with a nonprofit called Beyond Plastics to develop some of these ideas. And you know, since the pandemic, we've also been thinking about new prototypes. You know, with Beyond Plastic, we've been talking about what kind of new prototypes might come out of this. For example, you know, no-touch installations, or also the possibility of even hand washing stations that could kind of take on some of these functionalities. So this is Fail of the dog drinking from the fountain. So just to wrap up, these are just a selection of projects that I'm working on, and they're maybe representative of some of the overarching concerns of the practice. And of course, it's a kind of evolving set of explorations. And I just want to thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join the talk, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. So thank you so much.
Tei, thank you so much. I guess one of the sad parts here is maybe missing out on the applause that we generally expect, but I'm sure the 150 some odd people listening are all clapping at home. So, you know, despite wanting to sort of selfishly take over the Q&A, I see quite a few questions coming in. So I think let's start with the audience first, and we will just sort of see where it goes. So the first question I want to put on the table comes from AUD faculty Roger Sherman. And what Roger says is, in the New Mexico project, you were working in a field not native to architecture and design. Wondering if and who else experts you may have worked with, and how. Wondering where you learned the science behind these projects. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Roger. It's a really interesting question. You know, actually, in working with this project, it's been interesting because the life has sort of taken on a different course, I actually ended up presenting the project at a nuclear waste management conference to people from AECOM and to actually people who are managing the website. We've been sort of in conversation about how these kinds of technologies would actually function. A lot of it was research. You know, I was teaching at Columbia, and the Earth Institute actually, and the scientists up at the Doherty Observatory have been doing some really, really incredible work. Specifically, that's how I came across it, and talking to some of them actually about, particularly about geologic and mineral sequestration strategies. And so a lot of really kind of amazing cutting edge research is coming out of that. And then, you know, I was pointed towards that, and I think just also just doing some research, I think this kind of, there's a kind of overlap between, let's say, decarbonization and then also geoengineering, which is a kind of really, I think, controversial area of study. But it was sort of an opportunity to try to learn more about that. And so I sort of pointed in some directions with some of these colleagues and also with some friends who are also involved actually in climate science. Yeah.
Maybe just to follow up on Roger's point, and you know, I see it in a number of your projects. Like on the one hand, and maybe specifically with the New Mexico project, let's say there are shades of that project that let's say remind us of like the design fiction movements, etc., in design. And then on the other hand, let's say with the hydrant project, like an extreme pragmatism to, let's say, even to the point of producing a patent drawing, you know, working with the master plumber. And so I guess in like, my question is, in balancing these extremes, and as you say, might continue to evolve the hydrant project or projects like this, you know, do you see your agency, let's say, moving towards like the proof and manufacturing of things, or let's say the production of narratives that can grab interest at, you know, at a broader level with infrastructure, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There's a lot of expertise that is necessary to bring these prototypes, these hydrants, into reality. And what's actually interesting is Chris, who is my collaborator, his specialty or his area of interest is in speculative design and actually interaction design. And so his work really focuses actually on extrapolation and featuring somehow. So there's a kind of nice collision, I think, of pragmatism, but then also I think ways in which we might speculate about near futures together on that project. I think for the hydrant and like the development of the hydrant into its next phases, we've been working with a kind of a plumbing engineer, and then also with people actually who work more at the scale of you know, like landscape and sidewalk elements, and just sort of kind of going through specifications and these kinds of things, because once you start to work in the city, there's a lot of sort of safety issues that come out as a result of those kinds of things. You know, so I think personally, it's maybe not necessarily in the kind of super development of the kind of technicalities of it. I think I'm really much more interested in the kind of storytelling and the kind of narratives and how to sort of produce these ways of imagination, like visions of these sorts of projects. But it is actually really interesting to see how these really small kind of elements that pop up in cities necessitate so much specificity and so much technical expertise in bringing them into the world.
Yeah, I particularly admire, well, the way that you work with narrative without reduction, right? Like you're able to both present something in its simplicity and its complexity without completely reducing the idea for the audience. I do really appreciate that across the breadth of all your work. So another question coming in from Sarosh. Oh, sorry. There's a lot of questions, so my queue is a little jittery here. So sorry, things are popping around. So Sarosh Anklasaria asks, "Thank you," or states, "Thank you, Tei, for an absolutely fantastic lecture. You have hands down the most beautiful office name. How did you come upon agency?
Oh, thank you. I think for me, the agency tries to kind of do two things at once. So there's a kind of double agency or double agentness in the name. I think I like that on the one hand, it kind of talks about, let's say, a way, like an ideology, right? How ideology and design might have relationships to one another. So the kind of agency of the architect. But then I think it also ties then to the noun. I think Garrett, you kind of mentioned the noun versus the verb. I think the noun of the agency as something that's an office, there's going to be something more than an office. So the kind of expansion of office into agency and maybe takes on other kinds of projects. And then actually, the way we think about it is that it's actually connected with a line. So there's actually like an M dash that connects the two agencies together. And so I kind of like that doubling or that, that multiplicity idea, I think comes out maybe in the doubling of agency.
That's great. There was a couple questions that came in during your discussion of Big Brothers, Big Sisters. And so I'm going to collapse those two questions. One was simply, what is the area of this project? And I'm not sure if that was, well, we know it was in Houston, but maybe a question related to the size and scale of that project. And then perhaps you're able to dovetail in a second question there, which was, what is a particular reason why private offices were favored in that building? Is it because of meetings with minors on site, et cetera, things related to occupant safety or otherwise?
Mm-hmm. So the area of the building is about 20,000 square feet. And the private offices are something that the organization really wanted. I think maybe, I don't know if you could tell in the existing images of the project, but some of those existing offices, no one actually had any privacy and no one could really make phone calls. So it was sort of a very kind of jerry-rigged office culture before. And so I think, I think also the offices were necessary. Some of the closed offices were necessary because there's really kind of private information that is shared amongst the staff and then amongst the kids who are coming in to the organization and then also the mentors. So it's really kind of private confidential information that is shared. And so having degrees of privacy, actually there's a meeting room on that floor that's actually just a phone room that people can go into who are roving employees. But it's really about privacy, not so much to protect minors, but actually to allow for sort of confidential conversations to happen.
That's great. Okay, so now I'm really juggling lots of questions.
So there might be one for both of us, I think.
There is a question from Philip Brown. It says, "Thank you, Tei, for presenting your work. You've presented several imaginative public projects. The clients are private, nonprofits, and also public agencies, perhaps both in some cases. Do you find difficulty pursuing public works through public agencies, federal or local? And has your agency had more agency designing the public realm, working through the sort of private clients?"
Let's see. The projects, they kind of have to happen my experience is they've happened a little bit hand in hand. For example, working with BMW and ADO, they were able to connect us with someone at the DEP who then was able to get a lot of things rolling on our end, just in terms of opening up some doors. I think at this moment, you know, how to get access to the hydrants, how to sort of figure out how they operate, what are the kind of controls and the kind of regulations around it. I think working with public agencies, there's definitely layers of bureaucracy in those organizations, but I think what I found are these really amazing characters who are, you know, kind of figures in those agencies who are really engaged and motivated and really dedicated to public space. You know, so this guy we were talking to at the Parks Department, he was so excited about the project and wanted to kind of run with it and have them installed in some of the parks that he was managing. So to some extent, what was interesting is how the public agencies become about certain individuals that are kind of really helping to drive those projects. And so I think that kind of way of breaking down the barriers of those agencies has been something really useful for me to actually learn and like move projects forward. You know, I think funding streams are always a question when you're working in the public realm. You know, Beyond Plastics is trying to help us figure out how we fund, you know, how do you fund kind of prototyping and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of ways in which the private realm has been able to support the public realm, for example, with the Hydrants project, has been really productive.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so just skipping around. So let's go to Phoebe's. I won't answer Phoebe's question, although it's for both of us. But I can. So maybe a question for both Tei and Garrett, or maybe I'll answer it in part. Your relationships to art practice regarding reference and collaboration seems much closer than some other practitioners. Does this stem from common source? If not, Tei, how do you position your practice within this framework? I mean, I guess in full disclosure, Tei and I did sit one desk apart in studio for at least a year. So
at least a year, yeah.
And we went to school together, and you know, I would say, like many architecture schools at Princeton, there was certainly an affinity to the arts and art practice, both through art history being a kind of prominent part of the art, you know, the campus, through faculty, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to hear your answer on this, of course.
No, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think that we are kind of, you know, I think you have a background in art, of course, at Cooper. So I think that's informed other references for you. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of osmosis that also happens in graduate school, no? Where you're kind of around similar, you know, faculty, you're kind of thinking through ideas together. You know, I'm thinking about faculty members like Stan Allen, for example, would bring a lot of, I think, art references to the table. For example, I think also, you know, having the art history building right next door was, I think, really kind of formative as well. And so, you know, I don't know that, you know, I think Garrett and I maybe I think we maybe share affinities, but I think we have a slightly different approach, maybe formally, to things. Yeah, you know, I think that we could maybe share a sort of similar base or kind of base of references, but I think the kind of deployment of those references might be a little bit different, I would say.
And I think maybe some similarity is, and this is why I love the agency part of your agency, is you know, most artwork exists in the realm of representation, and you know, there's certain bridges outside of that that way of presenting work. And you know, I think thinking of your hydrant project, I of course I go right to Michael Rakowitz's inflatable structure, these kind of tacked on HVAC structures that became you know, lightweight homeless shelters. This was a project done in the 90s. And I think of that in relationship to your hydrant and how you deal with that as an architect instead of as an art project, right? Michael's project existed in photographs and in galleries. There were no patent drawings. There was no plumber.
Right. You're right.
But yeah, so I think anyway, I like the evolution out of a kind of art base into the pragmatics or the physical making that's possible, and to be in a place maybe 20 years ago no one would have accepted those ideas as real components, but now maybe we can look at them as real possibilities.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's actually like really important for me. I mean, at least in the practice, is how to kind of, think about an idea, kind of conceptualize an idea, but then also how to kind of bring it into the world. And I actually really enjoy that moment where it has to translate, and that you have to like kind of convince and translate people to get on board and sort of think about how these things are going to work and function. And, I think that I agree. Like, I think that's kind of to some extent, the architectural training somehow of like wanting to sort of figure out how, something's going to work to some extent. Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, there's a question coming in from Florian Lepinard. We've talked about the hydrant quite a bit, and his question talks about the hydrant, but I think it gets to something else that we haven't talked about, which is scale. So I'll read it, but it was something I was interested in too. So Florian says, thanks for a great lecture and for great storytelling. You seem to look at how infrastructure prototypes can conserve resources over time at multiple scales. What is your advice to successfully bridge across scales and fields of expertise in these projects? But I think the scale question is really fascinating. Like how you say, look at anonymous things, tiny things within infrastructure, and infer a much bigger project or a much bigger problem, and then at the same time look at huge projects in which you infer a human scale or a connectivity one doesn't have in, like, say, looking at landscape or a mountain, etc., but making that a kind of human scale problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like about this advice about successfully bridging these scales and fields. I think it's also the admitting that I'm not going to figure it all out, right? So I think it's also about the sort of team building, the team building, and I think also the kind of forms of collaboration and the kind of interdisciplinary knowledge, and thinking through how, one weaves expertise in, or how one weaves and like actually starts to admit that we are generalists to some extent with many things, and how do we sort of bring in experts that can help us to work across those skills and those fields of expertise. And so I think, for me, I think really kind of trying to pinpoint what is the expertise that I don't have, and to think about how to kind of like fill that out or enrich it or nourish it somehow, whether it's through colleagues or it's through friends or it's through forms of research, like that kind of thing. I think that kind of bridging across scales, and I think also expertise.
And so, are you doing okay? We still have more questions. Are you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm good.
Just checking.
Yeah.
So we have a question from John Paul, who wants to know, how does your philosophy background help with your designs?
Oh, my background in philosophy. Yeah. So sure, I had I did a liberal arts degree in philosophy, and then also in visual art. And I think it's, for me, it's been useful in thinking about how to structure a kind of framework or like way of thinking. So, when one writes philosophy papers, or is when one writes philosophy papers, it's actually highly, highly logical. And you have to really understand how arguments are built from the beginning to the end. And so I think somehow that kind of way of seeing, or that way of kind of framing things has become a really useful tool for me as a kind of like way of thinking logically, but then also sort of thinking about how to build out these kind of stories and these narratives about the projects. You know, and then I think also just I think just the intellectual ecosystem of that background, I think helped me enormously to sort of think through and like sort of step back conceptually about some questions, you know, and how I approach things, you know, on a day-to-day basis. So maybe not assuming an answer, but kind of being able to step back and sort of think through like larger concepts.
That's great. And you know, maybe one more, if that, does that sound, yeah?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So, you know, this question goes back maybe to how you laid out your lecture with these broad categories, right? The multiplicity, the everyday collective, coexistence, etc., right? And it comes from Alexis Luna, who has a question about, you know, how you might deal with collectivity. And her question is, the curation of work here is truly incredible, and bringing up themes of collective authorship and coexistence early on really broadened the ambition of each project. Thank you so much for presenting. How would you say you go about finding projects that can explore themes like environmental coexistence or collective authorship? And I assume she means from the start, perhaps. Are these themes inherent to the project scope, or more of a lens that develops throughout the project?
Hi, Alexis. Nice to see you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like how to find projects, I think that it's, you know, for me, I think it's maybe not about finding the perfect project. It's kind of building out a project somehow, or like thinking about how to design, you know, thinking about like, for example, the hydrant project, there was not necessarily a multi-species part of it, but we kind of thought about ways in which that the hydrant could be a kind of coexistent infrastructure, for example. You know, and I think so to some extent, I think also these days it feels like the desire to start to design one's own projects somehow, or, you know, this sort of entrepreneurial practice model, I think is more and more something that I think will be necessary to start to bring projects into the world. And so I think there's going to be projects more and more that maybe people aren't asking for, and that you actually have to begin to kind of set up your own frameworks of your own work to think through how to actually see these ideas through. And they may not be immediately obvious, but you know, I think sort of thinking about the design of these ideal projects, or like what you're sort of seeing around you, and how you would want to see something like collective authorship start to come into the world. You know, I think more and more this model of practice is going to be kind of up for grabs.
Right.
You know, as we, you know, I think especially now, for example.
And so this is another question to leap off that last word, the now. There is a question about the now, perhaps related to unfolding ideas of technology, right? And so this comes from Adelina Koleva, and she says, "Hi, Tei, good to see this work again. My question is, the last project struck me because it's trying to connect a more simple mode of living, a less wasteful mode of living, let's say going backwards from the fancy water bottle to ordinary water, for a more technologically complex age where we've come to expect curation, accommodation, and a certain advancement or innovation that contributes to entertain or provide pleasure. How does this tension between climate, public health awareness, and consumer culture inform your practice?" Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Addie. Thanks so much for joining the talk. Yeah, I think it's complicated. You know, I think yeah, I think this question of climate and public health and kind of consumer culture, you know, I think more and more, you know, when you talk about going backwards, I think more and more about the kind of simplification of the ways in which we live, right? And the kind of simplification of, you know, modes of living and kind of the resources that we're using. You know, I think, you know, ways in which maybe less wasteful, for example. And so I think, I think also just right now it feels like consumer culture is actually really kind of being questioned, and this sort of constant buying and accumulation of things, I think, is also kind of at stake right now. And so I think I think that these questions, I think the projects want to sort of poke at that, kind of poke at some of these holes and sort of poke at the ways in which public health and then consumer culture can actually start to kind of align or kind of displace one another, so that there's maybe some awareness that's built about how our day-to-day going in because we're thirsty to grab the water bottle might actually start to inform some other way in which we're affecting oil consumption, for example. And so not in a moralistic like wrist slapping way, but I think that I think we're kind of trying to weave in those narratives to some of the projects. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. And let's see. This is different than the other questions, so I'm going to give it to you.
Okay.
And this comes from, excuse me for not getting your name correct, but Venkata Krishan. And the question is, thank you for your potential sharings. Your projects are mostly out of orthodox architecture products, I think meaning non-orthodox. So what is your opinion on architecture for non-humans? And I mean, I like this particular question related to your, let's say, research in second natures, landscapes, the hermit crab in the bottle cap, so, and perhaps I'm misreading the question. I don't see this as a type of like question about architecture for aliens. I see it as a question for, let's say, a non-anthropomorphic view of architecture that I do think is very present in your work. Maybe less so the buildings and more so the research,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's something I think about a lot. I think even just how we have to sort of shift perspective. How do we sort of shift perspective, and how do we shift our assumptions of what we need to accommodate ourselves, or how we need to live versus the perspective of a raccoon or of a cat or of a bird, right? I mean, there's different ways in which these species actually need affordances, whether they're environmental or they're kind of species or habitats that are required for these kinds of species. And I think at the start it's sort of kind of throwing out a lot of assumptions, honestly, like throwing out a lot of assumptions of how we might build something, and then kind of trying to look more carefully at how species are how they're building things for themselves. I think even I think Garrett also, like in your work, or I think in something like Testbed, this idea of entropy, and like how can we kind of take notes from bigger processes that are kind of occurring, whether it's like sand dunes, for example, or that there's kind of like larger scale processes that maybe start to point towards ways in which we might be able to think through about formations, about building, that maybe are not comfortable, let's say, for architects, or for immediately obvious, let's say, for humans. And so I think it's kind of allowing there to be some sort of vulnerability built into how one is thinking about design when it's not for us necessarily.
That's great. And so maybe one last, because there are two more questions on the board that tie into maybe this idea of what is not obvious, or what is not seen, and they come from Zhufan and Ken. And my apologies to both of you, but I am going to sort of collapse these into one, two sort of very long questions. But I think one is about, let's say, water as a kind of hidden material of architecture, right? Something that is hidden infrastructure, et cetera, something beneath the surface of the city. And then I think Ken's question is maybe more direct to, let's say, the first couple slides you showed, and is certainly about a different type of invisibility. And he's talking about, talking with family about wearing masks, and a sort of new social contract that we have between one another as we occupy our communities, et cetera. And maybe it's too ambitious to tie these together, but let's say one is the invisibility of like physical materials, and one is like this kind of other new invisibility that we're dealing with that is shaping our sort of public spaces. But I wonder if you have any thoughts to address and stitch those together.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I'm really interested in the idea of invisibility, and even like Garrett, you're talking about the sort of invisible material of water. But I think the kind of also unexpected materials that maybe we don't consider in our kind of palette or like in our toolkit. And so I think, whether it's sort of something that actually feels really obvious that could be water, but it's not used. It's something so fundamental in our everyday life, like water, wind, sun, as kind of really fundamental elements that we kind of think about as our own materials. At the same time, I think, I think the mask question is also talking about the climate, I think somehow, but that also there's maybe materials that are, these kinds of questions of byproducts, or the kind of questions of value and of waste. Waste products that actually maybe are also not necessarily in our lexicon, but possibly for I think our generation and like generations to come, that might start to get folded in to how we think about design, and I think it is already now to some extent. But yeah, I mean, I think just these questions of kind of having a disposition that kind of sort of speculates, or can kind of anticipate other ways in which we might design, or kind of look for materials that might not be necessarily obvious, I think is something that for me is interesting. And I think even that question of the climate, climate and the invisibility with the mask, I think that's also about the air, right? It's like that 6 foot distance. It's about the sort of transmission, so I think that's even a way of thinking about how things move in space, the transmission of air particles, for example. So I mean, I think that would be almost like a force to think about as a kind of design process somehow. So I hope that maybe helped to tie it together a little bit, for me at least.
Well, yeah. Thank you one more time, and we have, I'm sure, one more round of silent applause scattered across Zoom right now. But I just want to thank you so much for taking on this format, and for rounding out the lecture series. And I've heard so much about how enjoyable the lecture series has been, and how excited people were that we did find ways to continue it. And just thank you again, Tei, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really such my pleasure. It's great to see you, and thank you everyone for coming and listening into the talk. Great. So thank you.
Thank you.